Well, welcome everybody. I'm Bob Henderson, and I claim to be Bill's best friend, and and am honored to have that station in life. Bill, I've got to tell you, I have been so excited to have this gathering because your book, which I'm going to hold up, and you and all of you who read backwards will be able to see this clearly. In service to justice, striving to bring forth our nobility. I read the book, I loved it. Many of the episodes and stories I had known from you. We had talked about it over the years. But one of the reasons that I was so excited and really eager to have this conversation is that we've entered the stage in the development of the Baha'i community of society building. And the society building is intended to transform the inner life and social environment of the entire civilized world and to bring about a new world by changing our inner condition and therefore the policies that we govern by and the institutions that we form and so on. And none of that can succeed long term unless we refashion our justice systems. And so here you have a book that tells the story of a young boy from Hazard, Kentucky. And as you know, I've been to Hazard, and it is just what it sounds like. It's this is where the Dukes of Hazard come from, and it is deep in the heart of Appalachia. But from Hazard, Kentucky, you go on a mission of lifelong spiritual mission that leads you to the Peace Corps in Chile, to the leadership of some of the largest justice systems in the world, and to an international mission of court reform and justice reform in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Transcaucasia. And in doing so, you gave us excellent models and deep insights into how abiding faith, knowledge and skill wizened by experience, and relentless perseverance can help us accomplish things that seem to be impossible, but are, in fact, the tasks for us to accomplish in our society building mission in this age. And so with that little bit of introduction, I just wanted to set the stage just a little bit to welcome you and to express my excitement about this conversation. And now, Bill, I want to ask you to start with a story. And it's something that we talked about just the other day. And it is the story of that occurred in law school at the University of Kentucky, when you challenged the constitutionality of the tenants' rights laws in Kentucky. But what was interesting about that was you didn't have standing in the court to challenge. You did bring about a constitutional challenge. And toward the end of the story, you linked it to your relationship with your grandmother. And in that, there were some very interesting insights about the seeds of morality and ethics and spirituality that were planted in your heart as a young boy. So please start with that story and walk us through it.
Thanks, Bob. And it goes without saying, our friendship has lasted over 40 plus years, and it's a treasure to me. And only my wife and daughters have the same spot in my heart as you do. So thank you for agreeing to do this. Well, I'm a hillbilly. I grew up in Hazard, Kentucky, and it's a whole nother culture, different place. And I was fortunate enough in law school to be with one other gentleman named Ron White, permitted to practice law in landlord and tenant cases with the supervision of a law professor. And so we looked at Kentucky statutes and we were going before lay judges, magistrates that are lay judges, and we found some questionable constitutionality questions. We raised them in the magistrate court, and the judge threatened to throw us out the window, and he meant it. However, we were successful. We took the case to the Kentucky Supreme Court, then called the Court of Appeals, and a law professor, our supervisor, argued the case. Of course, as not admitted to the bar, we weren't permitted to do that. And it did change the constitutionality of the landlord-tenant law in Kentucky. You raised my grandmother. You mentioned my grandmother. I'm sure everybody has a story about their grandparents at some point. My grandmother was a deep influence in my life. She was a very devout Christian. And as a young boy, I spent time. She lives in Jackson, Kentucky, which has gained recent fame as our current vice president claims that he has some history in Jackson, Kentucky. So, but my grandmother used to grab me and walk down the street. We'd go to the Methodist mission, and she impressed upon me that religion, the purpose of religion was service. Belief was you gave life to belief through service. And so that never left me. It was transcendental in every aspect of my life. I think about her and, of course, pray for her every day. The second person in my life that was instrumental was my uncle, who was a country doctor in Hazard, Kentucky. He came back from the Second War, having been a doctor in a number of theaters. And it's interesting when I reflect on it. I was at his home on many occasions when people would come, and at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, you could hear him outside yelling, "Doc, Doc," and he'd get up. He never said no. He got in his old Willys Jeep, which he had from World War II, and took off to the hollers of outside Hazard. He later became the mayor of Hazard, and when he unfortunately had an untimely death, 10,000 people came to his funeral.
Oh my goodness.
And he was, but he was a selfless servant. And so those two personages in my early life helped give examples that have stayed with me through my life, all 80 plus years. So for me, going to law school was trying to find a way to be of service. And this experience of challenging the constitutionality of a provision in the Kentucky statutes was evidence that I'd made the right decision, because it impacted the lives of many, many hundreds of people by virtue of the change. It's not really relevant to talk much about the substance of it, but the outcome. And so as my wife, Connie, and our 2 daughters moved west, we ended up in California, where my wife was from. And I was fortunate enough to get a job in the California Supreme Court. And in the course of 2 years, was able to work on some very significant things, foremost of which was conducting the first national study on the language needs of non-English speaking people in the justice system of California. This is 1973. At that time, the kids in the California system of education spoke over 250 languages. Mm-hmm. So you multiply that and what happens in court systems that are completely overwhelmed with the kind of challenges that presents. Our study was foundational. It's the first large study ever done in the United States, and it led to the adoption of a comprehensive system of interpreters, which has grown and become far more sophisticated now. And I was privileged to testify in Congress on the same topic, and the congressman from San Jose, Don Edwards, who was the chair of the Judiciary Committee, told me your testimony was critical in getting the same legislation passed in Congress. So I've been
You know,
fortunate. Go ahead, Bob.
I just wanted to pinpoint an issue here because there's a common thread in the story about challenging the constitutionality of some of the tenants' rights provisions in Kentucky, and the interpreter program and the study that preceded it in
Right.
California, because the common issue is the oneness of humankind, that everybody deserves
Right.
an equal opportunity for justice, for representation, and to participate in the social life of the community.
Well, we did this study and we held hearings in 5 different major inner cities in California. We had testimony from hundreds of people from all walks of life and multiple languages of their experiences, either with the police or with the court system or with being imprisoned. We went to a women's prison, took testimony from women in prison. The foundation of our work was drawn from the experiences of people who had had encounters with the justice system. You know, the justice system is like the spinal cord of a society. Everything touches it. You can't do anything in a society when your justice system is frayed or not functional. What happens is people become doubtful that their rights will be protected. They become fearful that things might happen to them and they'll have no recourse, or their family member won't have recourse. So when you look at this framework I mean, it's not just a U.S. society. Every society in the world has the same contextual framework, and at the core is the justice system. Mm-hmm. It's the spinal column. So you touch the toe, you've touched the whole system. So once you understand that as a principle, then the question is, where are the reaches of the system touching society, and is it being done in a fair and a just way? And if it isn't, then you got to find strategies to address that. And if anything, that's a synthesis of what I've tried to do in my 40 plus years of working in the field of justice, is find avenues that address the human needs of people who, and particularly people without any resources, who are virtually.
Well, Bill, let's go after that for a little bit, because I have a couple of questions that are directly related to it. One of the things that I really like about that story is that it highlights the importance of human equality built into policies and institutional practices.
Right.
But the other thing that I like about it is that you built a new system that systematically guaranteed that people who speak different languages would be able to be represented and to participate and have access to justice and fairness. But I wanted to link that to a couple of other systems you built that were similarly unique. One was the State of California Commission on Race and Ethnic Bias, and the other was the State of California Commission on Gender Bias.
Right.
And these are monstrous systems. Now let's, for the sake of the friends, let's just put this in perspective. The state of California is one of the largest justice systems in the world. If I understand correctly, it's the second largest justice system on the planet. And bearing that in mind, you're talking about incredible complexity, incredible institutional interaction, lawyers, policemen, judges, all kinds of folks who have a stake in the system. And yet there is fundamental inequity on the question of race and ethnicity, and on the question of gender. And you built systems that, in one of the largest justice systems on the planet, that went after those things. Tell us the story of how this came to be and the work that it did.
Well, I'd like to take exception when you said you built. Nobody does things in the justice system all by themselves.
course.
Let's start with the gender study. It was begun by the former Chief Justice of California, Rose Bird. She appointed a commission, and she was voted out of office. The subsequent Chief Justice appointed me as the administrative director, and we assumed the continuation of the study that she had launched and expanded it. And once again, public hearings, extensive public hearings, and then hearings again in prisons and other places to hear the challenges that face women as they come in contact with the justice system, from lawyers women lawyers who recounted tales of being insulted by colleagues or by judges, being mistreated by police, or finding that actually the language and the written text of court procedures being insensitive to the impact that language would have on their operations as a lawyer in the court, to incarceration practices. It's a whole gamut of things. And fortunately, there was a judge appointed to assume. It's interesting, it was a male judge, Ron George, who ultimately became the Chief Justice of California. And he fully embraced the whole purpose of this study and was able to bring it to conclusion with a very high degree of satisfactory results that were implemented by both either statute or by rule of court or by education through our Center for Judicial Education. The initiative, if anything, had the impact of raising, I would say, the visibility of women judges in California, and as many assumed, increasingly higher levels of positions of administration, and it was transformative. And believe as people who, well, not just, I'm not going to talk just about judges, that throughout the whole system there was a sense that people were listening to the concerns that women were facing in the justice system, whether it's a police officer, a court bailiff, a court clerk. And sometimes we think, well, it's a study, and so therefore it's kind of without feeling, I guess is the word. I'm searching for a different word. But when you see in the eyes of people that someone is actually interested in their well-being and trying to understand the steps that they have to go through to live their life, conduct their professional activities, and that same person, in this case, entity, the Judicial Council, is interested in making fundamental changes so that those impediments that have been in their way are, if not fully eliminated, are greatly reduced in the impact they have on life. So I was, as the director of the office, my staff and I were critical in trying to make sure we heard all the voices that were being raised, and we were accurate in reflecting those in reports and strategies to implement them.
Bill,
go ahead. Then I
just wanted to ask you to zero in on a particular aspect, because this is of such fundamental importance to Baha'i belief about how society is built and transformed. The participation of women as two wings of the bird are an essential prerequisite to the progress of humankind globally. I can't imagine that, notwithstanding the study results, which we could all anticipate, that the process was not without problems, without impediments, because you're talking about a historical habit of bias that you're trying to change in the operation of a huge system with lots of folks who didn't just read your paper and change.
Right.
So how did you get around that? How did you persevere?
We found male judges who were very much in line with this thinking, and they became the most outspoken advocates for advancing the cause of women.
So you found
Uh,
champions.
Sorry?
You found champions.
Yeah, we found, and they were men. They were everywhere in every court. There were men who were sympathetic. And not to say that the women weren't, I don't mean to diminish that. But the strategy was to find as many male. But let me go back. You said this is the biggest court system. Well, that's true. So you can't effectuate change on a systemic basis because someone at the state capitol, or in this case at the Supreme Court, made a decision. That's just
Right.
that's not effectual. What you have to do is you have to realize that in all the settings that happen and the lunches that happen with judges every day, you've got to have champions in those rooms talking about these issues. So we had strategies to identify those champions. Illustrative of that is I would go out every week and have lunch with judges in courts all over the state of California. And I would float ideas during those lunches, and I could readily identify those individuals who were interested in
I bet you
change
could.
and those that weren't.
Yeah.
And so the ones that were interested in change, we put on committees and we brought them in. We created a nexus with those who were our agents so that because ultimately the voices that exchange across the lunch table in a court is you need those voices to be really strong if you want to make some change. It's not because some formal process has happened, some rule or some procedure. It's ultimately organizational change is going to come from the bottom. Ultimately.
So Bill, let me just pinpoint a really important point that you're making right now. Abdu'l-Baha talks about change and development as moving from strength to strength. And what you did was you went out and you found the beginnings of strength. You found male champions
Right.
who were leaders in the system, who were open and even actively participating in advocacy to champion women, and you essentially made them put them in the leadership of a change process.
Absolutely. This goes back to my Peace Corps experience. It's not what you know and what you do; it's what people decide they want to do,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you put them in a position to make best decisions? What kind of actions do you do to create favorable conditions for things to be understood, processed, and then for ownership of what's going to transpire to be done by the people who are most affected by it?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's like creating this. I always visualize it as creating a group of people. That's an inaccurate way to say creating. You're not creating anybody. You're trying to find people whose sympathies lie in this area and who are anxious to see things change. After all, I was honored to be invited to the National Judicial College in the early 90s to give the Robert O. Jackson Lecture, which is the honorific lecture they give to judges being trained at the National Judicial College. The theme of my talk was the code of ethics for judges needed to be changed. And it needed to have provisions that judges had the affirmative obligation to improve the operation of the justice system. That doesn't exist. It's not in writing. Mm-hmm. And this comes from 20 plus years sitting in those same lunchrooms, listening to people say, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is a brilliant insight of nothing. And trying to find ways to create a sense of that everybody has an obligation to leave things in a better condition than what they found them. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting in the room talking to people who don't want to change, don't want to do anything different. I used to tell the new judges in California, they had 6 months max before they became a part of the problem. In the first 6 months, they'll see the system as it is. It's warts, it's ugly, it's not operative, and that they should take note. They should write it all down because after 6 months, they'll be a part of the problem. And the need to have a sense of profound obligation to leave the justice system better than you found it was really what I was seeking to achieve. It wasn't successful, but nonetheless, it seems to me that this is how you've got to infiltrate. That's probably not the right word, but to infiltrate the thinking of people that they have to be on the edge of their seats thinking, is this being done well? Are we doing the best we can? That's the question you have to ask every day. And if you are, then you're going to be digging around and wondering, did this man whose interpreter did he make it? Was this accurate? Do we know that? Is the record good? I mean, the things, let me go back, and a lot of people advocate grandiose change. We want to change everything. And, we see that in some of the Baha'i groups. Well, we're going to change. The truth, you've got to worry about where people are standing, right, where they are on the ground. What happens to them every day? What happens to them when they come into the courthouse? In Lima, Peru, we changed the whole structure of the trial courts, and we put young people, they were young people, and they greeted people as they walked in the courthouse. This had never happened in public administration in the history of Peru. People were in shock. And they had nice uniforms. They looked nice. How can I help you? This was unimaginable. My point is, justice isn't just somebody making a decision about what happened at the end of the process. It's interesting. Most of the studies that people's opinion about the justice process come to the same conclusion. People just want to be heard. They'll accept a judgment even if it's against their. But if they feel they've been treated fairly, they respect the system. Well, you multiply that. What does it mean to be treated fairly? It means when you walk in the door, somebody's interested in what can I do to help you, and then the next step, how can we help you do this, and so forth. So that's the mindset that you want to foster and cultivate, so that even the clerk at the lowest level of the system is as vital as everybody else. And that's the message I always tried to communicate.
And that's a central integrating principle through these first two stories. I mean, the interpreter program makes sure that people can be heard. And affecting gender bias highlights fully half the population and amplifies their voice in the justice system process.
And that when we in Macedonia, we introduced the idea of a public survey of services. Well, this is a former communist country. These people could give a hoot about what people thought of them. So it took us a while to get them to agree to do it. And they were recalcitrant, to say the least, in the beginning. After about 4 or 5 months, every month, they took the results of public, surveys and produced a report. They had a meeting. They talked about it. The first 3 or 4 months, they dismissed it. Then I'm not exactly sure what caused the transformation, but a point happened, and people began to, because someone said something positive, that began to move others to think, oh, wait a minute, it's not just about complaining, it's about doing something affirmative. And after about 6 months, they embraced the idea that listening to what the people had to say about how they're doing justice was important, and they embraced it. It sometimes, well, I'll leave it at that. I'd start, my penchant is I start a story and I'll go down a whole different road.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've got a couple of questions. One of the things that I just want to draw a circle around is that you and I, over the years, have talked a lot about a models of unity approach to managing change. And that is exactly what you're describing now, where you find folks who are coming your way, who are open to new ideas, who are willing to consider the possibility of change or a point that is strong enough to build on. And you start that with the confidence that as you build that strength, you'll accelerate momentum, and it'll increase your capacity to get at problems and resolve them fundamentally. Now, I want to move on to the Race and Ethnic Bias Commission, but before I do, I would
Right.
like to ask you to highlight some of the changes that resulted from the Gender Bias Commission.
Well, it's like a 4-inch. There were we changed, of course, all the obvious things. Pronouns were changed. Language issues were addressed. Um, but then there's a very accomplished called the California Center for Judicial Education, which is the critical arm in the judiciary in California for training, educating judges. And that led to a whole series of courses being developed and still ongoing, trying to make everyone aware of their own behavior and how that behavior is felt and received by people who are the object of insensitive remarks or behavioral patterns that are offensive. But from that led to a number of legislative initiatives to try to create a different way in the California legislative system, excuse me, to ensure that women were treated more fairly. I mean, it's a long subject. We can't go into it today, but that's
But you know, the link
that's 1987. So that's a ways back, and I've been gone a long time, so I'm not in a position to give a up-to-date analysis. But I do know from a number of the women and men who served on the commission, they felt it was one of the most significant things they'd ever done in their entire lives. And they felt that this was meaningful. This wasn't just another quote study, close quote, that went nowhere. It went very deeply, and out of that became very effective advocates who remained vigilant that the system would be making significant changes.
And so if you draw a circle around some of the key elements of this change process, you ascertain the facts through a variety of studies. You had individual initiative, that is, people had to do stuff.
Right.
But what was interesting to me was that you established a link between how we're thinking about the issues, the behavior we engage in, and the performance of the institution itself and the process of justice. You see, so it takes it from how does Bob think? How does Bob feel about equity and how does Bob engage folks through to how does the justice system perform? And I just wanted to isolate those connections because when we talk about society building, that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
We have to change habits of thought, habits of the heart, and habits of behavior that are foundational to changing policy, structures, and systems.
Well, a couple of observations. You have to rely on the goodwill and the eagerness of people to do the right thing. They don't need a lot of instruction. They don't need somebody telling them, it's not like the experts sit in a room and decide this is what needs to be done. If you believe in the human capacity to strive to bring about better conditions, then you put people in a position that they can do that.
Yeah.
You support them. You give them information if they need it, and then you let them consult. You create a favorable condition where they understand that their voice will be heard. They understand that their participation is vital. They understand that they have an obligation with all their colleagues when they return home to talk about what they've just done or what they are doing.
So you're talking about letting people self-initiate and self-organize in a bigger framework with a better vision.
Yes. It's funny. I'm not sure why this is out of context of this, but it's relevant from a different standpoint. In Kentucky, when I went back we were managing a state takeover of the judicial system. Well, there are 120 counties, which means there are 120 buildings plus. And all of a sudden you're standing at a door wondering, well, what in the world do we do with 120 buildings? It's actually more like 160. And how do we create a system to create a ongoing capacity to address these issues? So I asked this young man, a law student from Louisville and going to Harvard, and he came down and said, "I'd like to work with you." And I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" He said, "Just be useful." So I sent him to meet with the biggest bank in Kentucky, the Central Bank in Louisville. I said, "Don't you return until you figured out how to solve this problem." And I mean, he looked at me, his eyes got big, and I mean, he's just maybe 21 years old, and I'm giving him the biggest problem he'll ever face in his life. You got to solve how are we going to maintain court buildings? But that's because I've always believed in the capacity of people. If you tell them what you need to do, they'll do it. And you just try to create favorable conditions so they can arise and find out in themselves what they can do.
Yeah.
I didn't have to tell him, do this and do that and don't do this and no. He's perfectly capable to figure that out. And
yeah, just a point. I know you're a big fan of John Cotter. So am I. The change management theorist at Harvard. And one of the things that he says is exactly that. That if you let people self-initiate and self-organize with a vision of purpose, and they will astound you with what they can accomplish.
It's just the belief in the capacity of people to find, it's interesting. Well, it's a whole other subject later in the
book. Bill, let's move on to the California State Commission on Race and Ethnic Bias, because that's another huge and foundational change, and both women and race and ethnicity are fundamental to the conflicts that are rife in American society today.
Well, let's start with one of the great and most interesting dimensions of California is it is the whole world. The whole world is here. I just mentioned kids speak over 250 languages. It is this amalgam of people from everywhere. And, I think most of the world thinks it's mostly Mexican. That's just not the case. Once the gender bias study was completed, I recommended the council that we launch this race and ethnic bias study. It was chaired by a member of the Supreme Court. And they stayed in existence for, I want to say, 15 years almost. And they worked on a whole range of things, first with the obvious awareness, making, in this case, judges aware of the cultural dimensions of the people that are going in front of them and what's happening. Things that were tragic, assumptions that are made. Of course, if this is particularly acute if you don't have excellent translation interpreter services. So things are, in most of the world, there is no such thing as presumption of innocence. It's the exact opposite. So if the governmental officials arrest somebody in most of the world, it's not everywhere, it is assumed that you are guilty. You've got to prove your innocence. So this translates into behavioral patterns when a society like California, where particularly those individuals that come from countries where that's their experience, whether it's the law or not, it causes enormous personal risk, and it degrades the very concept that the justice is to be delivered. You multiply that with our history of race and race-related issues, where people have been mistreated, where we've gone through periods of political leadership that were sensitive to these issues and political leadership that weren't. and they were quite hostile. So this pendulum swinging back and forth, sometimes creating laws, sometimes creating procedures, leave populations in a sense of, I want to say weakness is probably not the right word, but that those in whose hands the justice system rests are not sensitive to the needs of this population. So we go back, we built on our experience from the gender bias. We built an elaborate structural educational process to make people aware, bring up attention to the experiences that people were having in the system. And then where substantive laws needed to be changed, this commission did that. And for those that have had a chance to read the book, if they read in the beginning, there's a comment or recommendation by a former member of the California Supreme Court who says in the book that service on this commission was the highlight of his life. It was the most meaningful thing he had ever done because he saw the ultimate impact in where they could make changes. It's not perfect, but you got to make the effort to make the change. And institutional change and attitudinal changes are really difficult. But again, the deficit here is my distance from those days is quite significant. It's almost 35 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
but at the same time, Bill, at the same time, the diaspora is global. So the world is integrating right before our eyes. And one of the values of this conversation and one of the values of those initiatives, even if they're now begun 30 years ago, is that it shows us that in complex systems with lots of folks and lots of folks who've been doing other things for a long time, change can be made. And you can put a stake in the ground that begins to move the ship of state in the direction of justice. And that's the point that now.
Bob, before you leave that.
Go ahead.
But you've heard me say this. I use the infallible rule of 1/3.
Oh yeah.
When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I worked with the Mapuche Indians in southern Chile. I noticed patterns with the groups that I was working with, and they always came down to this: 1/3 of the group never met a new idea they liked. They were nice people, maybe sometimes not, but 1/3 were kind of, I don't know, and 1/3 said yes. So the strategy was figure out where people were on the spectrum and work with the 1/3 that wanted to make the change. They influenced the middle group, and the other group, you can't change them at all. It's hopeless. So don't spend the time trying to do it. So I use that formula with the judges everywhere I've gone. Is I try to figure out on the spectrum who's actually interested, who wants to do things, and that's who you work with.
One of the things that I like about that is that the loudest thing that we all hear are the naysayers. If it's bad, if it's broke, or if it's violent, that's the first thing you hear. But if you create momentum that is constructive and positive, then you begin to raise a different kind of voice. And that voice can have impact as well.
Yeah. Well, that's as I laughingly call it, the infallible rule of 1/3. Actually, I've seen it, variants of that in some of the management literature, but anyway.
Bill, just in consideration of time, I want to spend a minute on your international work because and I want to approach it from a particular point of view. There is a quote in your book that is a showstopper, and it is a senator in Peru where you are doing a complete court reform and justice system reform process, and the guy says that the trial court improvement project has to stop because the courts are becoming too impartial.
Yes.
And this, you know,
Yes.
and so I just wanted to highlight a couple things. One of the
Well,
things that stops our confidence in the change process is the
yeah,
idea that everything is so hopelessly corrupt that you can't bring about change
right,
because of all
right.
of the impediments and the vested interests that people have in how the system performs to serve their purposes. And here's a guy, an elected representative of the people, who says justice is not in my best interest.
Exactly. And he's the brother of the president, by the way.
Oh my
He's
gosh.
the president of the Senate. That story's kind of there's a beginning and a middle and an end to that. I'll be brief. I got a call. I was in Buenos Aires and was flying to Ecuador, and a lawyer in Lima called me and said, "Could you stop in Lima for an afternoon and meet with the newly constituted people from the Fujimori government that just gotten elected because they want to change the justice system?" I said, "Sure." So I stopped. And I go into a room in the Supreme Court, and it's full of Army guys. They've got their, epaulets on. They got banners hanging off, and there's this giant chart with lines going every which way, and they give this presentation, and I'm standing there and I'm thinking, "Are you kidding me?" And at the point that, so Dr. Davis, what do you think of this? And I said, "Well, this is a recipe for failure. There's not a single idea here that'll work." And at that point, there was a hustle and a bustle, and I made a couple of other comments, and I left. And I went on to Ecuador to do what I was going to do in Ecuador and came home. So I got home on a weekend, and by Monday, I got a call from Peru. "Would you come down and manage this process for us?" So I went back with the United Nations Development Office, and they wanted to address corruption. I said, "Well, look, there are ways to do this, uh, and let's go back to what I said earlier. Let's look at the basics. Let's look at organization. Let's look at process, and let's see where those things are working." And anyway, long story, we ended up creating a whole new trial court structure. I got summoned by the Bar Association of Lima to come to the headquarters of their office. There were 600 people in the auditorium, and I'm sitting up there. And I mean, I think they were ready to roast me. Anyway. So the young man asked me a question, "Dr. Davis, what do you think about this process of eliminating what we call ex parte communications? That is, their system allowed the one lawyer to go see the judge privately and argue his case. It was also the source of where corruption took place more frequently than not. And we eliminated that. They couldn't go unless the other party was present." So I said, "They told me in law school, never ask a question you don't know what the answer to is ahead of time." So, and at that point, in the United States, we've been doing it for 200 years. You don't have both parties present. It's subject to being abused. Well, that didn't go well. So that led to public protests for a week with a tent in front of the Supreme Court and newspapers. And so it was all pretty dramatic. And I remember a lady judge asked me, said, "Well, who else has done this?" I said, "Well, in Latin America, nobody's had the courage to do it, but in Europe, they've done it already." So we implemented the system. And about a year out, Senator Fujimori, brother of the president, made that statement. He called the UN office and said, "You got to stop this right now. System's becoming too impartial." And that was the end of that. So we lost our contract and went on to do other things.
Yeah.
But
We know that these change processes are going to proceed in fits and starts. And but it's really important that you give people a vision that change is possible and that it can be productive and positive. Now, you tell a bunch of stories about leaders as cannibals who are consuming things and policies and each other and all kinds of things. And you tell a great story about how they compensated the judges in Colombia to incent control by the cartels. If I recall correctly, the judges were paid something like $13,000 a year, which was not enough to do anything on. And of course, that meant that justice was essentially for sale.
Yeah, Colombia is an extremely complex place, and it's a real challenge to make valuable contributions there. Its own history is, I mean, we're all attuned to the drug issues, but prior to the drug issues, there's a lengthy and bloody history of. It's also a place where some of the smartest, most able people on earth are. I've got some really remarkable friends, and so it's the dialectic of crisis and victory, I guess, in a sense. It's a very interesting place.
The larger, I think the larger point that I was trying to get at and wanted you to comment on is that, yes, corruption is everywhere. It's here, it's anywhere people are. But that does not mean that constructive processes of change can't proceed.
Right. Well, I've got, it's a long history. I'm trying to figure out where to make a point. The minister, one of the ministers of justice with whom I worked extensively, Nestor Martinez, was really an advocate for making fundamental change. He ultimately ran for president unsuccessfully, but he called me one day because we had done some work in dispute resolution, and he said, I've heard about this group in San Francisco that I told him about called Community Boards, and they do training for people to learn how to mediate disputes on neighborhood basis. It was his thinking was, I've got to find a way to reduce violence, and I've got to create a system where people can resolve their own conflicts without resorting to some sort of violent behavior. And then secondly, we talked about the youth program, the children's program that started at Community Boards. Well, long story short, he sent a whole delegation from the Ministry of Education of Colombia to San Francisco. They spent a week. They went through everything that the Community Boards was doing. You go on the website now, the Ministry of Education of Colombia, there are 5 million children in mediation programs in Colombia. And when Nestor and I talked, I said, this is a 15-year proposition. You've got to look at fundamental institutional and attitudinal change takes 15 years at a minimum. And these kids that started are going to be the ones that grow up with a whole different way of looking at how can I resolve conflicts. But that's how things, I just happen to be a conduit. But it was his initiative to say, we've got to find ways to build different societies built on peaceful means of resolving conflict.
One of the things that I really like about that bill is that it gives us a very practical example of how systematic generational change is made.
Yeah.
You put a process in place and you nurture it and you sustain it, and ultimately it begins to have an impact on the culture because people think differently, they see different possibilities, and they're oriented toward fairness and justice, right, with a sense of confidence that they can carry that out.
Right. Yeah, I gave a lecture at the Judges Association in Buenos Aires, and at the break, this judge came up to me and I was talking about mediation. He said, I don't understand why we're talking about meditation. And so I figured, well, it's probably my Spanish that's a problem here. So we ended up talking, but we had, the story's longer than time permits. The legislative framework, the legal framework in Latin America always had a conciliation phase in it. Mm-hmm. And I'd go to courts and ask them about conciliation. They said, well, nobody wants to do it. And I said, why is that? We don't know, but they don't want to do it. should ask lawyers, oh, well, if you ask for conciliation, that means you don't believe in the strength of your case. Well, long story short, we started a process in Argentina, which is now all over Latin America. Every country now has modified their statutory framework to create a mediation phase. It's now extended into family courts over the objection of some church authorities in some countries. It's extended into civil, but it was a process. And in this case, I was able to work with a group of women judges from Argentina who were just phenomenal in their capacity to relate and talk to fellow judges. But the goal was to create a whole different dynamic, because the formality of the legal system doesn't always allow the process to get to the bottom of the conflict. So if you can create a process where people can actually use their own voice, bring that voice to the process, this is what I'd like to see done, and so forth, there is a sense of justice when you walk out of that room. And but that's the strategy that we've followed very successfully all over Latin America.
One of the things that I really like about the integrating themes of the stories you're telling is that these approaches worked in places like California and Kentucky and in the federal system. They worked in Transcaucasia. They worked in Pakistan. They worked in Ramallah. They worked in Latin America. That these processes really can bring about fundamental change in the structure and function of critical institutions. Now, I want to ask you to tell a story, but while you do, I want to invite the folks that are listening to populate the Q&A box with whatever questions they have, so that we can begin to address some of the questions that have arisen in response to your comments. But you got to tell the story of the Peruvian gold mine, because it's such a great story.
Well, actually, the story begins in Seattle. The World Bank had their annual meeting in Seattle. I've forgotten the year, but I think it's about 1997 or 8, thereabouts. There were public protests in the streets. It was a pretty intense experience. The president of the bank, Jim Wolfenson, said, "I don't want to go through this again. It says that our processes are not reaching the impacted participants. We're not doing a thorough job in doing our assessment of impact on projects on people." And so he ordered the creation of an office called the Complaint Ombudsman Advisor, Complaint Ombudsman. And in 1999, the head of that office called me and asked me to organize the office and train the people and so forth. I was not able to do it. My mother passed away and I was distracted. So I directed them to a group in Colorado that I'd worked with and attended some of their training. That's all background. So a major complaint arises from Minera Yanacocha, which is in Cajamarca, Peru, which is historically very significant because this is where the Spaniards killed the last Inca. And that's a whole story unto itself. So this mining operation began in 1990. It projected that it had gold. It was a gold mining. It was a combination Peruvian and Newmont mining from Denver, Colorado. And they thought they had about 20 years of gold. And but for the first 10 years, they had this policy which staggers the imagination when you think about it. They didn't hire anybody local. They hired 5,000 people, and not one of them was from the Cajamarca area. They brought them from all over Latin America, which of course led to some pretty hostile local community feelings. They didn't buy anything locally. Of course, they bought on a scale that not many could provide. So they bought everything from Lima. In other words, there was an indifference to the local community. I don't know if you know much about gold mines. They're secretive operations. They don't like to tell you anything. So this process went on for 10 years, and it caused an enormous resentment in the local community, such that a local group started blocking the highway, and they wouldn't let the trucks with the mine's at 14,500 feet, the top of the Andes. So they would take the gold and transport it to the ocean. That was always four trucks. You never knew which truck had the gold. So they blocked the highway. It was costing them $1 million a day. So they filed a complaint with this newly constituted office, the complaint advisor, and I was privileged to be invited to be a member of the team to go down and see what we could do to ameliorate the situation. So we went down, we did an assessment. There was some interest, there was a lot of interest in creating a process, a mediated process. The night before we were supposed to start our process, the priest, liberation theology priest who was opposed to the gold mine, called all of the NGOs that were going to participate and told them if they participate, they'd never be able to participate in anything else again. Mm-hmm. So our foundational method of trying to bring the community together was put in a pretty tough spot. What happens is we invite the people who are impacted by the mine, who live on the highway going up to the mountain, and we've got a little over 200 people in the room, and we've got the mine, of course, and their hierarchy. We've got some local civic people and so forth. So we're starting a process, which I'm going to give background and then get to the substance. The very notion of the whole issue of creating this office is in a test. We're in test mode because none of the development banks in the world have done this. So the World Bank is moving out and creating a process to engage local people and hopefully find solutions to problems where the bank has big investments. So this is in the back of my mind. First meeting is, the room was so tense you could hardly take a breath. The leader of the local group that filed the complaint was a diminutive lady. Maybe, I don't think she was 5 feet tall. She wore a big bowler hat. And we had been told by local people that her method of discourse is shout louder, and then shout really loud. So those are the three modes of communication. And I was told by a dozen of people, if she starts on, shout, we're leaving. Mm-hmm. So I've got this in my mind. We're trying to hold all this together. It's like baling wire. And sure enough, Segunda starts off, and she's in shout right now, and she's going to shout louder next. I interrupted her and said, nobody's deaf here. We don't need, I said it in a more polite way, I think. Anyway, we got through that. And for the next 4 years, we had meetings, completely changed the policies of the mine with respect to hiring, with respect to purchasing. The mine created a foundation. The mine created a training for making gold to be sold to tourists. But there was a transformative dimension of this, which was very important. We didn't really know that most of the villagers were illiterate. We're writing on the wall, this and that and the other, and right. And we don't somehow or another it's not. So we realize that we've got a big challenge here. So you think in terms of you have to create a process where it's all visual but not written. Mm-hmm. So we do that. Then we invite 60 people that we will train them in mediation and consultation. And it was transformative. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. In common discourse, we say, well, I understand. That's like Baha'i say, I understand consultation. Oh, yeah. We're not very good at it, frankly. And these people say, "Oh, yeah, I know what conciliation is." Really? Tell me what you know. They don't know anything. Nobody's ever trained them. So we started a whole process training these half 60 people. And in the evaluation, I still get emotional about this. I actually have a couple of the documents. Many of the participants were young women, young mothers, worried about the impact of mercury perhaps on their children. And this one young lady writes in her evaluation, "I never dreamt in my life that I could come to the city, Cajamarca, and participate and have anyone listen to me.
Mm-hmm.
But this has happened."
Mm-hmm.
And, but again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. If you put yourself in a position to give people the necessary skills to do things so that they can address them themselves, they'll do miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
I just looked at it 2 days ago. The mine is still operating, even though they thought they only had 20 years of gold. It's still ongoing. I mean, people can argue about, well, the environment and so forth. Well, it's an environmental issue and it's a challenge. The mine made adjustments, but for literally thousands of people, they have a more sustainable life than they had before.
The among the questions, there are two that you have begun to address that I'd like to have you say more about. One is the sustainability of change. You've talked about change processes from the United States, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and the sustainability of that change is critical. And the other, which is directly related, is in the arena of improving and making positive change. How do you navigate partisanship? Because it's directly related. The partisan pitfalls impede sustainability. So if you would say a word about sustainability and managing partisan pitfalls.
Gosh. You get to ask any question, but one that complicated, I can't answer in brief form.
Yeah. Well, actually, so from my point of view, you've really been talking about both of them. And here's what I'm hearing. One of the things that I'm hearing is that you've got to find entry points in all parts of the system. You've got to find entry points in the population that's affected. You've got to find entry points in members of the system. You've got to find entry points in the constitutionality, the framework by which the system operates. And then you've got to embed change in the structure and daily processes. So part of what I'm hearing is that sustainability depends on your ability to find those entry points at every level that the system operates. But one of the points that you've made consistently and repeatedly is that if you invest confidence in people and challenge them to do a big good thing and appeal to their better angels, they will arise to do that. Yeah. And that's one of the big drivers of sustainability in these processes. And you've talked about that in Peru, you've talked about that in Colombia, you've talked about that in the California system, and so on. Then the other, partisanship, you really talked in your description of the rule of thirds. One of the strategies that I drew from that is that it's how you begin to build a positive counter argument to the partisans who don't want change.
Right. Well, I'd like to go into that, but I also want to let some people ask questions.
Well, these are the questions. I'm reading the questions.
You're reading the questions now?
I'm reading the questions.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm in the slow learner group. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'm here to help.
Well, let's go back. I mentioned the judgeship, how I'd used working with judges. I never asked anybody what party they belonged to. I just looked for people who I thought were susceptible to looking into things with a fresh eye. And if they evince that sort of dispensation, those are the people I asked the Chief Justice to put on committees. And whether I never knew what party they belong to. Partisanship is it's a challenge. I mean, there's no way around it. It's a challenge. I worked with the judge from who was appointed by President Reagan, who was the last defender of Richard Nixon. He was a congressman from Orange County.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting man. And you wasn't the most open to making big change, but if you could find a place, and it turned out I played golf, he played golf, we found a point of interest and we could build a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was always finding a path to a relationship where I could have a discourse. Like my friend who was the chief judge in Arizona, very conservative, but we were really good friends. We found ways to collaborate, and this is where the Baha'i concept of consultation is indispensable. You learn how to communicate without offending. You learn how to speak. I spoke up in meetings with judges that were, the Ninth Circuit is 40% of the federal system, 14
Mm-hmm.
states in the Western state. So this was a court of enormous support. I was able to participate, but not because I was intent on driving my idea, but it was really to try to take as I have always understood it, the Baha'i concept of consultation,
Mm-hmm.
of focusing on the issue and never on the person.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can find a way to do that by establishing a relationship, it opens the door for all manner of things to be done.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that by drawing a circle around a point you made, and that is somehow you've got to navigate the distance between being an issue for someone else to being a human being,
Right,
where you can have authentic communication
right,
and you can begin to interact on a human level and start breaking these things down and making sense out of
right.
issues. That goes to another question that was raised about the strategies to help differing sides find points of unity in the process of consultation.
Say that again. I didn't hear that, Bob.
I said the question was about strategies to help
Right,
differing sides find precious points of unity
right.
that might allow different sides to find common ground.
Right. Well, the key to that, I write in the book, my whole approach to consulting and working with groups was to start by focusing on something positive.
Mm-hmm.
The worst part about management is it compels you to look for the negative. And ultimately, it's hard to build bridges once you do that. If you can start by finding something positive and affirmative to begin with and draw on that, it opens up an unlimited potentiality. So in meeting after meeting, my whole focus always was try to find, even if I knew something was said was something about which I had a different point of view, was to find an affirmative way to say whatever it happens to be. And that all of a sudden it's like a switch. People go on. We're so accustomed to hearing the negative. We get we just hump up and we're going to go, oh. If you can find the affirmative, I'll tell the story in the book. Meeting with the justice in the Supreme Court of Guatemala, and we just started a project. And he talks literally, I'm not joking, a little over an hour and a half, uninterrupted, denouncing the United States of America since the Arbenz government in Guatemala. And I didn't have anything to do with that. So, but 1.5 hours later, I found something to say positive about Guatemala. 40 minutes later, he's asking for help, and 50 minutes later, we're working on a plan together. But, you just have to look for that opening and then find a way to say something affirmative. And it's like the doors open all of a sudden. That goes back to Abdul Bahá's message. You've got 10 bad qualities and one good. Focus on the good one. You will be amazed what happens
Yeah, and they're all, and Bill, they're all around you. All you have to
Yes.
do is open up to them. Now, we get so blinded by the problem we came to solve that we miss it. We miss a lot of the opportunities to build a human connection.
Well, see, that's if you start with the problem to solve and not with the relationship to begin, you made a mistake. You got to start with a relationship before you start with the problem,
You
and
know,
you can't get anywhere if you do that.
when you began and you were making the point about the Gender Bias Commission in California and the race and ethnic bias, one of the things that you said was you were on planes every week, all over the state, having lunch with everybody and building an understanding about the desirability and the doability of a
Right.
huge change.
Right.
And after a while, what happens is you get buzz. You start to get
Yeah.
traction and people start to talk to each other, and it becomes a possibility that begins to gain momentum.
Well, I'll give an illustration. We were obligated by the legislature to engage in the largest civil delay reduction effort in the history of the United States. The 9 biggest courts in California had to do X, Y, Z. And I said, well, what about there are 58 counties? Well, what about the rest of them? And my strategy was to get more than 50% of the county, the government, of the judiciary of the state involved from the beginning. So we started with 9, which were obligated by statute to do this. And I asked for volunteers. I had 30 volunteers.
Wow.
So we already had the whole state involved with volunteer. Courts wanted to do the right thing. You just have to give them the right. You have to create the door. You have to create the bridge. You have to create the opportunity, and people will arise.
Wow. One of the comments that was made by one of the folks online was that she says, I'm not a legal person, but I get this. I understand
Good.
what you're talking about because essentially you're talking about massive, complicated change with
Right.
all kinds of vested interests and partisanship and corruption
Right.
and history and all that stuff. But essentially the principles that are guiding your approach to managing changing of those systems are clear to us.
Yes.
They're not mysterious.
Well, I don't know. I'm just a hillbilly from Hazard, Kentucky, so I can't say much about what these are things I just came from within, and in my life experience, um, and just growing up and dealing with stuff and watching and observing things that worked, things that didn't work, and the Peace Corps experience was really critical in that. So,
Yeah, no question. Well, Bill, I want to make an observation, and then we will uh, pretty much be out of time. And I want to give you a chance to say something in conclusion, and then I have a short piece that I'd like to read in conclusion. And that is, I just want to note that, you came from a coal mining town in the middle of nowhere. And yet, God had a path for you to walk. And your heart was touched by a mission of service that you have pursued your entire life. And using the principles of the faith and the love in your heart and the skill and the experience that you gained over time, you've made fundamental transformational change in some of the most complex and deeply embedded systems in nations around the world. And it just goes to show that we don't have to take our faith on faith, that Baha'u'llah will put the wisdom, the power, the spirit, the sustainability in our hearts if we pursue it, and that we can come from anywhere, even Hazard, Kentucky, in the middle of
yeah,
Appalachia, and
yeah,
end up in Peace Corps, in Guatemala, in California, running the federal system at the Ninth Circuit, and on, and really have made change that would just seem impossible when you were a little kid running around in the dirt in Hazard, Kentucky.
Yeah, well, yeah, my,
But
my mother always said, don't leave them in doubt, Billy.
yeah. Well, Bill, we are down to the last couple seconds, but let me give you an opportunity to say whatever remains in your heart.
Well, for those friends who tuned in and for those who may or may not ever cross my path, I'm honored that you took time to be with us this morning. Um, I wrote the book because I thought it was kind of an unusual path. The faith has been integral to everything that's happened in my life, as well as my companion of life, my wife, who's at my side. And I've just had as I said earlier, my grandmother and my uncle put me on the path of thinking that service was the highest form of human expression. And so I've tried to give life to that. And the faith gave me a shape and a place and a vision for a world that my contributions might be in some way meaningful. So thank you for tuning in today.
And Bill, we're better for having read the book and better for having known you. Let me conclude with a comment that was made by Malcolm Feely, who is the Claire Sanders Clements Dean's Chair Emeritus, Director for the Center of the Study of Law and Society at Cal Berkeley. And Malcolm writes, I believe that Bill Davis has done more than any other single individual, be they Minister of Justice, Prime Minister, or Chief Justice of a Supreme Court, to bring about significant court reform to improve the quality of justice for hundreds of thousands of ordinary people around the world. He has accomplished this not with a utopian dream, the pocketbook of the Gates Foundation, or even power and might. Rather, he has succeeded by dint of personality and perseverance. First as a Peace Corps volunteer, then as a civil servant at the state and federal level, and finally, as the head of a small consulting firm which obtained modest-sized contracts to confront mountainous problems. He has then moved mountains. How? By his innate modesty, by listening, by drawing in like-minded people, by insisting on consensus, and by empowering those who would live with the consequences of the innovations long after he left the region. The Japanese occasionally single out a quiet but distinguished person and honor them as a national living treasure. If the United States had such an award, surely Bill Davis would be a recipient. Bill, we all feel that way. Thank you so much.